Hello and welcome to America in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Dan McCaleb, Chief Content Officer at Franklin News Foundation, publisher of the Center Square Newswire service. We are recording this on Friday, May 17th. Inflation remains elevated, the border crisis continues, sometimes violent protests continue to rage over U.S. involvement in Israel's ongoing war with Hamas. There's the ongoing criminal cases against former President Donald Trump, questions about President Joe Biden's age and mental capacity. All of these issues will be key factors in the build-up to November's presidential election. One issue that isn't getting as much attention is the ballooning U.S. national debt. Joining me to put our nation's debt into perspective is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. Casey, we reported at thecentersquare.com this week that the federal government has spent more on interest payments on that debt this year than it has on both national defense and Medicare. Give us the details and why it should matter to voters.
Yeah, you're right, Dan. This issue, particularly in the last few years, has accelerated. We've known for years that the national debt is a big problem. It's getting worse. But really, since COVID, the deficit in particular, of course, yeah, I know you know, but the deficit is how much money we're borrowing annually, whereas the debt is the total amount of debt that we have nationally. And the deficit it's spiked in COVID, and now it's over $1 trillion a year now, which before 2020, the deficit had never topped $1 trillion. It was less than $1 trillion. So we're in, this isn't like, oh, this issue has been going on for a long time, and which is true. It's not just that. It's actually sped up in how fast it's getting worse, and that has implications. So what are some of those implications? You alluded to it, but this is just an incredible fact that U.S. spending on the interest is surpassing national defense and Medicare. So, holding this debt has a real cost. It has the cost that we're spending more just holding the debt on interest payments to some of our biggest priorities. National defense, is for about $500 billion. Medicare is $465 billion, but interest is $514 billion in the first 7 months of the fiscal year so far. So, that is a kind of an incredible statistic, especially, Dan. We've been hearing for how long that Medicare and Medicaid, Medicare is insolvent, or Social Security, that we can't fund Social Security. It's going to disappear any year now. Your kids aren't going to get Social Security. And yet we're spending more on the interest payments than we are on these government programs that we're told we can't afford anymore.
Yeah, and the numbers are kind of shocking as you read them in terms of how much the U.S. has paid in interest compared to these other budget lines, Casey. And of course, that interest is only can continue to grow as the debt grows. We're at 34.7 trillion with a T, $34.7 trillion and counting. I'm looking at the U.S. debt clock right now. We're going to be at $35 trillion probably before the end of summer, and it's continuing to grow. So those interest payments that we're going to need to make are going to continue to grow unless the federal government, gets spending under control. But Casey, this is not an issue that's been at the forefront, at least not yet, of the presidential election. Do you think the presidential candidates, Biden and Trump specifically, should be talking more about the federal debt and how these interest payments are essentially squeezing out spending on other federal programs?
Yeah, it is a very difficult issue for politicians to talk about. It used to be the Republican mantle to hold up fiscal responsibility, and that really went out the window under George Bush and the Iraq War when deficits really took off. Now, of course, both Democrats and Republicans have been guilty of runaway spending. But the paradigm in the past was that Democrats were more loose with spending and Republicans were fiscally responsible. But in many ways, Republicans have set aside that mantle of fiscal responsibility. And then it was hard to argue for it during, for instance, the Great Recession. Is that really the time to buckle down and say, no, I guess not. And then COVID came along, and which politician is going to argue for cutting spending during COVID? And so we keep having these crises where no one wants to be the politician on the right or the left to say, now is the time to get our fiscal house in order. And it's snowballed, right? And so politically, it's very difficult to talk about this issue because the follow-up question, Dan, is, so do you want to cut Medicare, which is like a third rail for both parties? Oh, do you want to cut, Medicaid? Do you want to take healthcare away from poor families? So those are the immediate follow-up questions, and they make very potent attack ads. And so it's very hard for these politicians to say that they're going to cut spending because immediately whatever your favorite pet program is, you feel personally threatened, and like they're gonna cut that. If somebody and then if you want to cut defense, you don't want to protect America. So anything that you say you want to cut, it gives political fodder for all your enemies. But American people should care, and I think a lot of Americans care, even if elected officials are afraid to talk about it, because the national debt right now is, to put this in perspective, is well over $100,000 per person. Dan. So I mean, if we were to pay off the debt, every American would have to contribute more than $100,000 to pay off the debt.
Yes, and then this time next year, they would still, because of the deficit, they would still have already added another $1 trillion in debt, right? Because if they didn't get their fiscal house in order and didn't stop the spending, every American, Dan, you could take that sizable chief content officer salary and pay, $105,000 donation to the IRS, which I know you're excited to do. If we all did that, then yes, the debt would mostly disappear. But in 1 year's time, we'd already have, about $1 trillion in debt again because of the rate the government is spending.
But let me get my checkbook out, Casey, and I'll do my part. Kidding, of course. Casey, the president and former president this week agreed to 2 debates. Whether those debates actually take place, we'll see. But do you expect them to get any questions about the debt and what to do about it during these debates?
I'd be surprised if they do. Yeah, I mean, people are really concerned about the Ukraine war, about Israel and Gaza. They're really concerned about so many issues. And, in a lot of ways, the parties and the candidates decide what the defining issues are. Biden and his team want the defining issue to be that Trump is a threat to democracy, and that abortion. They want Trump's threat to democracy and abortion to be the main issues. Trump wants, immigration and inflation probably, and maybe a couple of others to be the main issues. And, cutting federal spending just isn't popular among Democrats. It hasn't been really in a long time. And in this populist era of the Republican Party, cutting spending just never quite makes the top of the list.
Well, thank you again for joining us today, Casey. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.